The document that ended 11 civilizations was 43 pages long. It had been filed with the Compact's Commercial and Trade Secretariat on the 14th day of the 5th month of year 2241 of the Compact calendar, which translated to roughly 11 years before I found it, and it had been logged, assigned a reference number, and processed without any member civilization's legal delegation raising a formal objection, because the window for objection had been 14 days, and 14 days is not enough time to read 43 pages of trade law when you don't know they matter. I found it by accident. That is the first thing I want recorded, because the Compact's reconstructed proceedings prefer a narrative in which the discovery of Instrument 7, Varenthis, was the product of systematic review, of a dedicated analytical process, of coalition legal resources properly deployed in the service of oversight. That narrative is false. I found it because I was looking for something else entirely, a discrepancy in the transit licensing fees for the Maracaibe corridor's secondary waypoints, which was my actual assignment and which I had been working on for 3 months without finding anything more interesting than a 2% variance in processing surcharges that turned out to be attributable to a data entry error in the year 2248. I was reading through commercial registration filings from the corridor's early development period, looking for the source of the fee structure and Instrument 7. Varenthis was referenced in a footnote of a 2,244 trade operating license for something called the Varenthis Syndicate Bioextraction Station, Maracaibe Corridor Node 3. I almost didn't pull it. 3 months of transit fee analysis had made me efficient at identifying irrelevant footnotes, and I'd learned to skip them. But something in the language stopped me. The operating license described the station's commercial purpose as extraction, processing, and commercial distribution of non-sapient, renewable organic substrate from baseline biological organisms within the Type 4 unclassified biosphere category. I did not know what that meant. I had a doctorate in compact trade law and 12 years of analytical experience with the Coalition's Treaty Compliance Office, and I had never seen the phrase Type 4 unclassified biosphere category in any document I had previously reviewed. I noted it, I pulled the reference, 43 pages, standard, compact, commercial instrument formatting, which means dense, numbered, cross-referenced, written in compact standard translation layer 7, which is the formal variant used for binding trade agreements and which requires a licensed translator analyst to parse accurately because it uses technical terms that have specific legal meanings that diverge significantly from their common usage. I was one of perhaps 60 people in Coalition space who could read it without software assistance. I had learned compact standard translation layer 7 because my dissertation had required it, and because I have a particular stubbornness about reading primary sources directly. That stubbornness is why I am the one sitting here giving this account, rather than some other analyst who might have sent the document to a translation queue and waited 3 weeks for a summary. I read Instrument 7, Varenthis, in my office on a Tuesday afternoon in year 2252, approximately 7 years into the syndicate's operating period under its provisions. I had a cup of cooling tea on my desk, and the sound of corridor traffic from the hallway outside and the ordinary ambient texture of a working day in the Coalition's Treaty Compliance Office. I read the first page and understood perhaps 70% of it. I read the second page and began to slow down, because the definitions section had a subsection, section 1.7, Biological Substrate Classification and Sapience Determination Protocol, that required careful reading. I read section 1.7 3 times before I accepted what it said. The Varenthis Syndicate had filed a commercial instrument that classified human beings as non-sapient, renewable organic substrate. Not all humans. That is important to understand, because the legal precision of it was part of how it had survived 14 days of objection review without a flag. Not all humans. The instrument applied specifically to baseline biological organisms of the type, for unclassified biosphere category who are registered under compact transit framework classification codes. T4 unclass bio, which was a classification code that had been inserted into the Compact's transit registration system as part of a 2240 administrative update to harmonize transit records with a new intermember species census. The update had been routine. Its passage through the administrative secretariat had generated no controversy. It had been a records management exercise, and what it had done, without anyone in the coalition's legal delegations understanding it at the time, was create a classification category for human beings traveling through certain transit corridors that designated them as unclassified biological organisms pending species recognition filing. The species recognition filing was a formality. Every member civilization went through it. The coalition had begun its species recognition filing in 2237. The filing had been expected to complete in 2240. It had been delayed by a paperwork dispute over the format of the genetic baseline submission, and then delayed again by a processing backlog at the Compact's recognition secretariat, and then delayed again when the coalition's filing agent misread a form and submitted an incomplete supplementary record that required correction. The species recognition filing did not complete until 2242. For 5 years, human beings traveling in the affected transit corridors had been listed in the Compact's transit records as type 4 unclassified biological organisms, not classified, not protected, not formally recognized under the Compact's Sapiens framework. The Varenthis Syndicate had been watching for exactly that window. I learned this later through the operational intelligence compiled during the Iron Covenant's deployment, the Syndicate's internal communications, the planning documents, the feasibility studies they had commissioned, beginning in 2236, when the Coalition's species recognition filing was first announced, and the Syndicate's analysts had identified the probable delay window and begun constructing the instrument that would exploit it. They had been patient. They had monitored the Coalition's filing process through commercial intelligence channels. They had watched the delays accumulate. They had held Instrument 7, Varenthis, in draft form for 4 years, ready to file the moment the unclassified window was wide enough to accommodate it. And they had filed it in 2241, 1 year before the Coalition's recognition completed, calculating that 1 year was sufficient to establish operational infrastructure that would survive any challenge the Coalition might mount after achieving recognition. They were correct. The infrastructure was established. The challenge, when it eventually came, did not arrive through any legal mechanism the Syndicate had been expecting to face. I set down Instrument 7, Varenthis, after the first read-through, and I sat very still for a long time. My tea had gone completely cold. The corridor outside was quieter than it had been. I became aware, in a way that I had not been aware before, of the specific quality of my own breathing, the measured, involuntary mechanism of it, the biological fact of it, the tissue and chemistry and cellular infrastructure of it functioning as it had always functioned, unremarked and unmolested. Then I opened the Syndicate's commercial transaction records, which were filed with the Compact's Trade Secretariat as required under its operating license, and I began to read them. There were 28,004 entries. Each entry had a transaction date, a station location, a procedure code, a yield record, and a subject classification number. The subject classification numbers were the Compact Transit Registration Codes, the T, 4, unclass, bio designations, not names, not ages. Not the fact that any of them had spoken in any language, had carried any thought, had held any person's hand, or walked through any corridor under their own determination. Classification codes. Transaction numbers. Yield records, measured in grams and cubic centimeters, and cellular viability percentages. I cross-referenced 3 of the classification numbers with the Compact's transit registration database. The first resolved to a woman named Della Satterthwaite, 41 years old, registered as having transited through Maracaibo Corridor Node 3 on a commercial freight passage in 2244. The transit record showed her as having arrived at the node. There was no departure record. The Syndicate's transaction log showed Procedure Code 7, VB, Neural, ganglionic, on the same date, yield 14.3 grams. Viability, 94.1%. Transaction closed. The second resolved to a man named Christoph Marin, 26 years old, in transit to a labor posting on an outer corridor agricultural station. Same pattern. Arrived. No departure. Transaction log, 2,244. Procedure code 7, VB, lymphatic sequence, yield, 22.7 grams. Viability, 91.8%. Transaction closed. The third resolved to a girl named Pita Solofa. She was 9 years old. She had been traveling with her family on the first leg of a transit that was supposed to connect at Node 3 and continue to her family's new residential posting on a Station 3 corridors further out. Her parents and brothers had separated from her at Node 3 for a connection on a different route that would rejoin at the destination. She had not arrived at the destination. Her classification code, T4 unclass, Bio 7, Kaida node 32244A0047, was in the syndicate's transaction log. Procedure code 7, VB, glandular, compound, yield 8.1 grams, viability 96.7%, transaction closed. I stopped cross-referencing after the third one. Not because the information was too painful to read, though I stopped because I understood that I was going to need to cross-reference all 28,004 of them, and that this was going to take time that I did not want to spend at my desk in my office on this ordinary Tuesday with cooling tea and corridor sounds. I needed to move. I needed to go somewhere and tell someone what I had found before I sat still with it long enough that the weight of it settled into something I could not carry. I called Director Yara Fennick of the Coalition's Compact Legal Oversight Division. I used her emergency contact channel, which required a formal emergency level designation under Coalition protocol, which meant I had to key in a 4-digit code that authorized the communication as an exigent matter of treaty compliance. I had never used that code before in 12 years of service. I used it then. Fennick picked up in 40 seconds. I had worked with her for 9 years. She was not a person given to visible alarm. When I told her what I had found, there was a silence on her end that was longer than any I had heard from her before. Then she said, "Read me section 1.7. I read it to her. She said, "Send me the full instrument. Send me the transaction logs. Do not speak to anyone else about this until I call you back." She called me back in 4 hours. In those 4 hours, 2 other senior analysts had independently confirmed my reading of the instrument. Fennick had elevated to Coalition Command. Coalition Command had elevated to the Compact's Emergency Legal Review Tribunal, which had authority to convene within 6 hours of a request. The tribunal had convened. It had confirmed that Instrument 7, Varenthis, was under the Compact's own legal framework, a valid commercial trade instrument that had been properly filed, properly processed, and properly recognized during its 14-day objection window, and that the operations it licensed had been conducted in full compliance with its provisions. It had also confirmed that those operations constituted, under the Coalition's own legal framework, the systematic abduction and biological exploitation of 28,004 human beings over 11 years. The Compact's legal framework and the Coalition's legal framework were about to have a conversation that the Varenthis Syndicate had counted on never happening. Because the Syndicate had calculated with some precision, I must give them that the gap between those two frameworks was wide enough to conduct a pharmaceutical industrial operation through and then file the documentation and never be called to account for it. They had been operating in that gap for 11 years. They had 28,004 transaction records to show for it. What they had not calculated was the particular stubbornness of a trade law analyst who prefers to read primary sources. I spent the 4 hours between my call to Director Fennick and her callback reading the remainder of Instrument 7, Varenthis, in full. I want to record what was in it because the summary accounts of the Iron Covenant's operations often reduce the instrument to its most headline legible feature, the substrate classification, and the rest of it is important for understanding scale of what the Varenthis Syndicate had built. The instrument was not a simple extraction license. It was a complete commercial framework. There were provisions governing the transit of subjects between compact registered waypoints and the syndicate stations, structured to look like standard cargo transfer protocols, using the same administrative language as legitimate freight routing. There were provisions establishing the syndicate stations as compact recognized neutral commercial facilities under Article 19's Commerce Port designation, which gave them a degree of inspection immunity that legitimate pharmaceutical research installations legitimately held. There were provisions covering yield classification and intermember trade of the extracted compounds, the neuroganglionic material, the lymphatic sequences, the glandular compounds, establishing them as licensed pharmaceutical precursors under the Compact's biomedical trade framework, complete with tariff codes and distribution channel designations for the 11 patron civilizations' pharmaceutical markets. The syndicate had not been merely extracting. It had been manufacturing, distributing, and selling on a commercial scale across 11 markets for 11 years. And every part of that commercial chain had a provision in those 43 pages that made it, under the applicable framework, legal. I want to be specific about what the compounds were used for, because this is part of the record, and because it is important context for the Assembly's proceedings. The neuroganglionic material was used in a class of cognitive enhancement compounds that were, at the time of the syndicate's operations, among the highest revenue pharmaceutical products across 7 of the 11 patron civilizations markets. The lymphatic sequences were used in immunological treatments for several chronic conditions prevalent in the patron civilizations populations. The glandular compounds were components in a range of endocrine modulation products. These were not niche products. They were mainstream pharmaceutical goods with established market histories, distributed through licensed channels, prescribed by physicians, consumed by ordinary citizens of the 11 patron civilizations who had no knowledge of what they contained or where the primary material had come from. I have been asked whether the end consumers bore responsibility. I decline to answer that question. It is not within my competency, and I do not believe it has a clean answer. I include the information because the evidentiary record includes it and because I believe a full account should not omit it. The cross-referencing work that followed Fenwick's callback took 18 days and involved a team of 18 analysts working in shifts around the clock. I led the legal analytical side and supervised a sub-team of 4 who handled the transit records matching. The identification database was built incrementally, one classification code to one transit registration to one name at a time. And by the end of the 18th day, we had resolved 27,891 of the dollar, 28,004 codes to confirmed identities. The remaining 113 required additional investigation to resolve. In most cases, because the transit registration records had been entered with errors, or because the individual had been registered under a transit alias. All 113 were eventually resolved. The work of resolving them, in several cases, required direct contact with family members who had filed missing person reports. And those conversations were conducted by coalition victim coordination specialists rather than by the analysis team, because that was the appropriate professional boundary and because I insisted on it even when some of my team wanted to make those calls themselves. I understood the impulse. I held the boundary. I want to be accurate about the timeline because the accuracy matters. The Iron Covenant's deployment was authorized 72 days after I filed my preliminary analysis of Instrument 7, Varenthis, with Coalition Command. 72 days is not a long time for a decision of that magnitude. There were people who argued it was not long enough. There were people who argued that the Compact's legal review process should have been given more time to explore remedial options, sanctions, reparations, instruments, the formal referral mechanisms that existed for intermember disputes under Articles 42 through 47. Those arguments were made. They were heard. They were heard by men and women who had spent the intervening 72 days cross-referencing 28,004 transaction records and resolving each classification code to a name and an age and a last known transit point. And in some cases, a family member who had filed a missing person report in 2244 or 2246 or 2249 and been told by coalition transit authorities that the individual had likely completed their journey without updating their registration and that transit registration discrepancies were common and not a cause for concern. The people who made those arguments in favor of more time were thoughtful people. I do not want to diminish them. Some of them were my colleagues. And they were not wrong that the compact's remedial framework existed, that it had mechanisms, that those mechanisms had procedural legitimacy. They were not wrong about any of that. But they had not cross-referenced Peter Salofa's transaction record. I had done it at my desk on a Tuesday evening after Director Fennick's call, after I had been instructed to begin the formal documentation process for the compact emergency review, and I had done it because I needed to know, and because I was the analyst of record, and because the work required it. I had read Procedure Code 7, VB, glandular, compound, and I had read yield, 8.1 grams, and I had read viability, 96.7%. And I had read transaction closed, and then I had looked up what Procedure Code 7, VB, glandular, compound referred to in the syndicate's own procedural documentation, which was also in the Trade Secretariat's records because the syndicate had been very thorough in its compliance filings. I will not describe what the procedure involved. It is in the evidentiary record. Anyone who has the clearance can read it. I read it on a Tuesday evening. Then I sat at my desk for a long time. I did not argue for more time. I was not part of the command decision. I want to be clear about that. I was an analyst. I provided analysis. The decision to deploy the Iron Covenant was made by Fleet Commander Adriana Koss and the Coalition's Emergency Military Council, and it was authorized by a unanimous vote that I was not present for and that I learned about through official channels, which is the correct way for these things to happen. I had provided my analysis. The command made their decision. I do not second guess it. I have been asked in the years since whether I think the Iron Covenant's response was proportionate. I tell everyone who asks me that question that I am a trade law analyst and that proportionality is a military and legal determination above my specific competency. Then I tell them about Peter Salofa. Then I stop answering questions about proportionality. The Iron Covenant was 430,000 warships. It was not assembled for Instrument 7, Varenthus alone. The Coalition maintained standing forces of that magnitude as a general matter of policy, and the deployment decision was the decision to redirect those forces toward a specific objective, rather than to build a new capability from scratch. The Covenant had a name already, and the name had not been chosen for this purpose. It was an administrative designation, the Iron Covenant, the same name the fleet formation carried before I ever found a 43-page trade instrument in a footnote of a transit licensing file. The name stayed because there was not time to rename it, and because the name was what the orders said. I think about that sometimes. The thing that ended 11 civilizations was named before anyone knew it would be the thing that ended 11 civilizations. There's something in that I haven't finished thinking about. I was assigned to the Iron Covenant's identification and documentation teams 48 days after my preliminary analysis. Director Fennick asked me if I was willing to go. I said yes before she finished the sentence. She told me I would be embedded with the teams entering the bio-extraction stations after the Covenant's advanced elements had secured them, and that my function would be analytical, cross-referencing the syndicate's on-site records against the transaction logs I had already processed, verifying identifications, completing the evidentiary documentation that would be submitted to the Compact's emergency review as part of the Coalition's formal record. She told me I was not required to go. She told me this assignment was extraordinary in ways that she was not required to describe to me because she believed I understood them already. I told her I understood them. I told her I was going because the names in those transaction records had been reduced to classification codes by people who had decided by legal instrument and commercial calculation that they did not require names, and that the least I could do was restore them. Fennick looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "I'll have your transit orders filed by morning." The transit to the Maracaibe corridor took 19 days. I spent most of them in a small cabin on the Coalition liaison vessel ECS Meridian Watch, reading. The syndicate's transaction records were now fully cross-referenced. A team of 18 analysts had worked through all 28,004 over the preceding weeks, and the complete database had been compiled and formatted for the documentation teams. I read it, all of it, every name, every age, every transit registration, every missing person report where one existed, every family contact where one could be found, every last known location. I read it the way I have always read primary sources, straight through, no shortcuts, accepting the weight of every entry rather than averaging across them. I want to record something about those 19 days, because the formal account does not include it, and I think it should be somewhere. There were 43 members of the documentation and identification teams aboard the Meridian Watch, and I was the most senior in terms of analytical experience, and the only one who had seen the original instrument before anyone else. The others were analysts, investigators, forensic documentation specialists, 2 medical consultants who would assist in the procedural verification work. We were a quiet group. The common areas of the ship were quiet in a way that felt chosen rather than accidental people reading, people working through their own section of the cross-reference database, people sitting with coffee or tea and not talking. We were not avoiding each other. We were doing what people do when the weight of something is too specific and too large for ordinary conversation, which is to carry it alone in parallel with other people carrying theirs. On the 12th night, one of the younger analysts, a woman named Takemi Ruan, who had been assigned to the cross-referencing team for the months preceding and had helped build the identification database, came and sat across from me in the small workbay I had been using. She was carrying a data pad. She set it on the table between us without speaking. I looked at it. On the screen was an entry from the cross-reference database, one she had been working on that day. A man named Saul Orentes, 53 years old, a supply chain logistics coordinator traveling between stations for a contract renewal meeting. His transit record, his missing person report, filed by his employer 14 days after his expected return. His transaction record, procedure, code 7, VB, neural, ganglionic, yield, 18.9 grams. Viability, 88.4%. Transaction closed. Below the transaction record, in a field that the documentation protocol allowed for supplementary notes, Takemi had written, Saul Orentes, 53 years old. He had been doing this job for 22 years. She didn't say anything. I didn't say anything. We sat there for a while. Then she picked up the data pad and went back to her cabin, and I went back to my reading. I have been, in the 12 years since, asked many times what the identification teams were like. What kind of people could do that work without breaking under it? I always describe that moment because I think it is more accurate than any characterization I could offer. They were people who understood that the weight of what they were doing had to go somewhere, and that the somewhere had to be the work rather than themselves, because the work required them to be functional and present and exact, and because the names required it of them. They were not unaffected, they were affected completely and continuously. They did the work anyway, day after day, record after record. I have enormous respect for all of them. I want that to be in this account. There were 28,004 names. I knew most of them by the time we reached the corridor. I want to record something about the nature of knowing 28,004 names before I describe what came after reaching the stations, because I think it is relevant to understanding the kind of work the documentation teams were doing and the kind of attention it required. Knowing 28,004 names is not the same as knowing 28,004 people. I want to be honest about that. What I had after those 19 days of reading was something more like the shape of each person as their records defined them. Transit, history, occupation, where recorded, age, the pattern of their movement through compact registered space in the period before Node 3 or whichever other station they had been routed through. In most cases, a missing person report, which contained what whoever filed it had chosen to say about who was missing. A spouse describing work habits and home routines. An employer noting punctuality and professional reliability. A sibling listing the things they had planned to do together that they had not yet done. These are not people. They are the imprints of people in the records that outlasted them. But they are something. They are the minimum the record could preserve of a human being who had passed through a compact transit node and not come out the other side. I read all of it because I believed, and still believe, that the analyst who is going to attach a name to a transaction code and sign that attestation with their professional credential has an obligation to understand whose name they are attaching. I could have done the work more efficiently. I could have processed the records without reading the supplementary material. The matching algorithm only required the transit registration data. But the matching algorithm was not going to sign the attestation. I was. And my signature was going to say, this code was this person, and I attest to it, and the attestation is accurate and complete. I wanted complete to mean something when I wrote it. At Maracide Corridor Node 3, the syndicate's largest bioextraction facility, on a morning that I did not witness directly, because the documentation team's vessels were held at safe distance during the operational phase. I have read the tactical reconstruction since, and I know that the station was secured in 11 minutes. Not destroyed, secured. The Covenant's orders specified preservation of the facilities and their records for documentation purposes. The syndicate's security complement, such as it was, offered no organized resistance. They were pharmaceutical and commercial staff, not military. The Varenthis syndicate had not built military defenses into its bioextraction stations, because military defenses were for entities that expected to be challenged, and the syndicate had not expected to be challenged. It had a valid commercial trade instrument. It had 11 years of uninterrupted legal operation. It had the Compact's framework on its side. The framework had just met the Iron Covenant, and the Iron Covenant had not come to file a countervailing instrument. Our transport docked with Node 3 17 hours after securing. I was the third member of the documentation team to board. I want to describe what I saw, not because the description serves any particular analytical purpose, but because I gave an undertaking to Peta Salofa's parents when I finally reached them after the Covenant's operations concluded, that I would put into the record whatever could be put into the record. And one of the things they asked me was what it looked like. It looked like a medical facility. That was the first thing, the sheer clinical ordinariness of it. White composite floors, sealed panels, processing bays, laid out with the same spatial logic you would find in any pharmaceutical production environment. Equipment that was recognizable in its function even when unfamiliar in its specific design. Inventory systems, storage banks, yield processing stations. Everything labeled, everything logged, everything maintained to the kind of meticulous standards that pharmaceutical grade work requires. The syndicate had been very good at its processes. Their quality control documentation was, in the specific technical sense, exemplary. The smell was the second thing. Antiseptic. Yes, pharmaceutical facilities all carry that, but beneath it is something else. Something that I do not have precise language for, and that I will not try to describe more specifically than this. It was a smell that told you, without any reference to documents or procedures or transaction codes, that what had happened in these rooms had been done to living beings, and that the living beings had known it was being done to them. That is not an analytical observation. I include it because the analytical record does not capture it, and because I think it belongs somewhere. The holding units were in the lower levels. I will not describe them in particular detail here, because the full documentation is in the Compact's evidentiary record, and anyone who requires the specifics can read it there. I will say only what is necessary for this account. The holding units were designed to keep the subjects alive and biologically viable through multiple extraction procedures. The syndicate's research had determined that certain compounds yielded optimally from living subjects and degraded rapidly after cessation. So the process had been designed accordingly. Subjects were maintained, procedures were conducted, yields were logged. When a subject was no longer viable, when the procedures had taken enough that biological maintenance became uneconomical, the subject was discharged. Discharged was the syndicate's term. It was in their documentation. Subject, classification code, number, status, discharged, date, date. I had seen that word in the transaction records. I had understood in an analytical sense what it meant. I understood it differently after Node 3. The identification work took 11 days at the first station. There were subjects still in the facility when we arrived, not many. The syndicate had been efficient, but some who had arrived recently and were still in the early phases of the process. They were evacuated immediately to coalition medical vessels. The medical consultants went with them. The rest of us stayed for the documentation work. The documentation work at the station level was different from the office work I had been doing for months. The syndicate's on-site records were more detailed than the trade secretariat filings. They contained procedural logs, equipment calibration records, personnel shift records, internal communications, the complete operational history of the facility, going back to its first day of operation in 2243. These records had to be authenticated, cataloged, cross-referenced against the external filings, and integrated into the evidentiary database in a format that would meet the compact standards for formal proceedings. This was exacting work. It required concentration and care and the ability to read for hours at a time. Documentation that described in the language of pharmaceutical process management what had been done in those rooms to people I now knew by name. I think there is a particular kind of moral labor in translating one kind of language into another. The syndicate's records spoke in yield measurements and procedure codes and viability percentages. The documentation we were creating spoke in names and identities and evidentiary attestations. Every time I moved a piece of information from one language to the other, I was doing something specific. I was refusing the syndicate's grammar. I was insisting, in the only language the compact's proceedings would accept, that the things described in those procedure codes had happened to people rather than to substrate. That was the work. That was what all 23 days I spent on station work were fundamentally doing. The documentation team's work was with the records, matching the syndicate's classification codes to names, verifying identifications against the cross-reference database, completing the formal evidentiary chain that would attach every transaction record to a human identity for the compact's proceedings. I was the lead analyst for the evidentiary work. I matched codes to names. I verified identifications. I signed every record with my professional credential and the coalition's documentation authority seal, attesting that the match was confirmed and that the name attached to the code was the true identity of the individual to whom that code had been assigned. I did this work for 11 days at Node 3, 7 to 9 hours per day. Seated at a workstation in what had been the syndicate's administrative office, surrounded by white composite walls and sealed panel systems and the quiet sounds of a facility that was no longer conducting transactions. I have been asked how I managed it. People mean the emotional management of it. I tell them the truth, which is that I did not manage it. I deferred it. I put the weight in a place that I could carry, and I did the work. And the work required exactness, and exactness required presence. And presence meant that whatever else I was carrying had to wait. I have had colleagues who found this response inadequate. I understand why. I can only tell you that the names required accuracy more than they required my grief, and that the grief was not going anywhere, and that it has not, in the years since, gone anywhere at all. It is still in the place I put it. It is very heavy and very specific, and I expect it to remain there. The Iron Covenant's operations ran concurrently across all 17 of the syndicate's bioextraction stations. The documentation team's work ran in parallel with the operational phase, which meant that while I was in Node 3's administrative office matching codes to names, 430,000 warships were doing what they had been sent to do. I received operational updates through secure channels. I read them at the end of each working day. I did not stop working to read them. The Varanthus Syndicate's 11 patron civilizations, the member states, whose commercial registrations had underwritten the Syndicate's compact standing and whose trade frameworks had provided the legal substrate through which Instrument 7, Varanthus, had been notified of the Iron Covenant's deployment 48 hours before its arrival. The notification had included the full text of Instrument 7, Varanthus, the complete cross-reference transaction database, and a formal coalition emergency instrument designated Zero Varanthus, which was the coalition's legal answer to the syndicate's 43 pages. Zero Varanthus was 11 pages. It declared the compact standing of the Varanthus Syndicate and its 11 patron civilizations null and void under coalition emergency authority, voided Instrument 7, Varenthis, and all commercial instruments derived from it, and formally notified the affected parties that the Iron Covenant would be arriving. The compact's emergency review process technically required a 72-hour response window before any military deployment in disputes between member civilizations. The coalition's legal team had analyzed this requirement and determined that it applied to disputes between member civilizations and that the Varenthis Syndicate, having been operating for 11 years under a commercial instrument that classified human beings as non-sapient substrate, had forfeited its status as a recognized member entity and was therefore not entitled to the procedural protections of the membership framework it had exploited to conduct its operations. The legal argument was 17 pages. I had co-authored the section on substrate classification precedent. I believe the argument was correct then. I believe it now. The 11 patron civilizations responded to Zero Varenthis in various ways during those 48 hours. 4 of them formally disavowed the syndicate and filed requests for coalition mediation. 3 of them transmitted legal challenges to the coalition's authority to issue Zero Varenthis and demanded compact emergency review. 2 of them transmitted what amounted to threats. 1 of them transmitted nothing. 1 of them transmitted a 47-page counterfiling that cited the original Instrument 7, Varenthis, and argued that the commercial operations had been fully compliant with applicable law. The Iron Covenant had been notified of those responses through the same secure channels that delivered operational updates to my workstation. I read the summary of the responses on the second night of the identification work. Then I went back to the transaction records and continued matching codes to names. Fleet Commander Koss made the decision, in consultation with the Emergency Military Council, to treat all 11 patron civilizations as complicit in the syndicate's operations. The 4 who had disavowed were treated differently in the operational specifics. Their infrastructure was not destroyed, their civilian populations were not displaced, but they were dissolved as sovereign, compact entities, regardless, on the grounds that their commercial registrations had provided the framework through which the syndicate had operated, and that their 11 years of silence had constituted material participation in what the transaction records documented. This was a hard decision. I have not been asked to assess it professionally, and I would not do so here even if I had, because it is not within the scope of this account. I will say only that I read the order when it came through, and I did not feel that anything had been done incorrectly. The Varenthis Syndicate's commercial infrastructure, the 17 bioextraction stations, the processing and distribution network, the transit route licenses, the yield storage facilities, the pharmaceutical production and marketing apparatus that had turned 28,004 transaction records into revenue was voided and dismantled over a period of 19 days. Voided and dismantled is the operational language. I will not translate it further than that. The stations were not places that needed to continue existing in their prior form. I was at Node 3 for 11 days. Then I was moved to Node 7, which was the second largest facility, and I spent 9 days there. Then Node 11, then the smaller nodes in sequence. I was part of the identification teams for 6 stations in total before the operational phase concluded. And then I was part of the central documentation review team that compiled the final evidentiary record for the compact's formal proceedings. Node 7 was different from Node 3 in one way that I want to record. The syndicate's operations at Node 7 had begun in 2244, a year after Node 3, and the records there were more refined, the quality control logs were more detailed, the yield optimization protocols more developed, the efficiency metrics more precisely tracked. The syndicate had learned from Node 3 and had incorporated those learnings into Node 7's operating procedures. This is the thing about pharmaceutical industrial operations conducted by competent organizations. They improve, they iterate, they optimize. The Node 7 records reflected 11 years of accumulated process improvement applied to what the Node 3 records reflected in its more primitive early form. Reading Node 7's quality control documentation alongside Node 3's was like reading the development history of a science, except that the science was this. I spent the first day at Node 7 doing something I had not done at Node 3. I sat in the empty administrative office with the on-site records in front of me, and I did not read them for a while. I sat with what I could see through the facility's internal windows, the processing areas, the storage areas, the maintenance corridors between them, the ordinary functional architecture of an industrial facility that had been doing what it had been doing every day for 11 years, and that had been doing it here for 10 of those 11 years. And I let myself understand, without mediation, through documentation language, what I was looking at. I gave myself 20 minutes. Then I opened the records and began the work. I tell this not because it was exceptional, but because I think it is accurate. The work required exactness. The exactness required presence. The presence required, occasionally, the willingness to simply be in a place and understand it before beginning to catalog it. I think any serious analyst who worked those stations would tell you something similar, though they might describe it differently. The complete record, when it was submitted, was 4,812 pages. It contained the full cross-reference identification for all 28,004 subjects, names, ages, transit histories, family contacts, physical and procedural documentation, status records, including the ones marked discharged, and for the 26,441 subjects whose discharge date predated the Iron Covenant's arrival, whatever secondary records we had been able to compile through family contacts and coalition records. The discharge entries numbered 14,227. That is the number I want to be accurate about, because it is the number that never makes it into the summary accounts of the Iron Covenant's operations, which tend to focus on the fleet count and the 11 dissolved civilizations, and the scope of the compact's revised commercial framework in the aftermath. 14,000. 227 is the number of people from those 28,004 transaction records who were not in the facilities when the Covenant arrived, and who are not alive. The syndicate's records are meticulous. The discharge procedures are documented in the quality control logs with the same clinical precision as the extraction procedures. I will not reproduce those procedures here. They are in the evidentiary record for anyone who requires them. I will say this: 11 civilizations had 11 years to know what those procedures were. The Compact's Commercial and Trade Secretariat had 11 years to read Instrument 7, Varenthis more carefully than it was read during its 14-day objection window. Every member civilization that processed a transit registration in those affected corridors had 11 years to notice that human beings were arriving at certain transit nodes and not departing. These are facts I have thought about every day since I found that 43-page document on a Tuesday afternoon with cooling tea on my desk. They have not led me to any conclusions. I am prepared to offer in a formal account. They are simply facts, and they sit with the other facts, and together they constitute the complete shape of what the Varenthis Syndicate did and how it was done. The Compact's Emergency Oversight Assembly convened 60 days after the Iron Covenant's operations concluded. I testified before it for 2 full days. My testimony covered the discovery and analysis of Instrument 7, Varenthis, the cross-referencing methodology for the 28,004 transaction records, the evidentiary standards applied throughout the documentation process, and the legal basis for Zero Varenthis and the Iron Covenant's operational authority. I answered questions from the Assembly's members for 11 hours across the 2 days. Most of the questions were about procedure. A few were about intent, the intent of the coalition in deploying the Covenant, the intent of the Syndicate in filing the instrument, the intent of the 11 patron civilizations in underwriting the Syndicate's standing. I answered the procedural questions with precision because they were in my competency. I answered the intent questions as briefly as I could, because the intent was documented in the evidentiary record and my personal assessment of it was not relevant to the Assembly's proceedings. I want to record one exchange from the first day of testimony that did not make it into the formal proceedings because it occurred during a recess and was therefore not on the record. A senior delegate from one of the 3 patron civilizations that had submitted legal challenges to Zero Varenthis, a civilization called the Thuron Compact, which had been among the Syndicate's primary distribution markets for the neural ganglionic compounds, spoke to me during the midday break in a corridor outside the assembly chamber. The delegate was a small figure, elderly by the physical markers I had learned to read in his species, and he spoke carefully in compact standard. He told me he had read my preliminary analysis of Instrument 7, Varenthis. He told me it had been very thorough. He told me that the Thuron Compact had not known at the time of the syndicate's filing what the instrument contained, because the Thuron Compact's legal delegation had reviewed only the instrument's commercial provisions and not Section 1.7's biological definitions, which had appeared on a routine filing review scan to be standard boilerplate substrate language of the kind used in dozens of pharmaceutical trade instruments. I listened to everything he said. I did not respond to it, because there was nothing I could say in that corridor during a recess that was appropriate to say. When he was finished, I thanked him for speaking to me. Then I went back into the assembly chamber and waited for the session to resume. I have thought about that conversation many times since. I am still not certain what the delegate wanted from it. An acknowledgement, perhaps. A concession that the ignorance was genuine. I have no way to know whether the ignorance was genuine. And even if it was, I am not certain what relevance it carries. 14 days is not enough time to read 43 pages carefully. That is true. The Thuron Compact's legal delegation had 14 days and did not read Section 1.7 carefully. That is also true. And there were 28,004 transaction records. These facts exist simultaneously. I have not found a grammar that places all of them in the same sentence in a way that feels complete. There was one question I was asked that I want to record here, because I think it belongs in this account, even though it was not a procedural question, and my answer to it was not an analytical answer. A delegate from one of the 4 patron civilizations that had disavowed the syndicate and requested coalition mediation, a civilization called the Veen Protectorate, whose disavowal had been filed within 12 hours of receiving Zero Varenthis, asked me, at the end of the second day, what I had felt when I first read Section 1.7 of Instrument 7, Varenthis. I told him what I told everyone else who asked me versions of that question, that I had felt a specific and particular kind of stillness, the kind that comes when something that you had been assuming was impossible reveals itself to have been happening continuously and carefully for 11 years. That the stillness was not the absence of feeling, but the compression of it, everything that the document meant, pressing down at once into a space that was not large enough to hold it in motion. So it went still instead, went cold and dense, and waited. He asked me if the Iron Covenant had been the answer to that stillness. I said it had been the answer to 28,004 names. The stillness was mine, and I was still carrying it. The Assembly's proceedings concluded on the 73rd day after the Iron Covenant's operations. The formal findings are a public record, and I will not summarize them here because they are not mine to summarize. What I will record is the outcome as it pertained to the specific instrument that had started all of it. Compact Trade Instrument 7, Varenthis, was voided retroactively to the date of its filing. The type for unclassified biosphere category classification was struck from the Compact's transit registration framework. The 14-day objection window for commercial instruments affecting biological operations was extended to 180 days, with mandatory active review by all member civilizations' legal delegations. The Compact's Commercial and Trade Secretariat was reorganized with expanded oversight capacity and a dedicated biological operations review division. These changes were unanimous. Every member civilization that retained its Compact standing voted for them. The 11 patron civilizations were not present for the vote. They were not present because they no longer existed as Compact member entities. Their dissolution was complete. Their surviving populations were absorbed into adjacent member states under humanitarian relocation frameworks negotiated over the following 18 months. I did not have a role in those negotiations. They were not in my competency, and I had other work to do. The other work was the notification process. After the Compact Assembly, I returned to the Coalition's Treaty Compliance Office, and I went back to the 28,004 names. The identification team's work had included locating family contacts wherever they could be found, but the notification work, actually reaching those contacts, speaking with them, giving them what we had found, was a separate process. Slower, longer, requiring a different kind of attention than matching codes to records. Coalition Victim Coordination sent specialists for it. I was not a specialist in that. But I had asked Director Fennick if I could be part of the process for a specific subset of the names, and she had approved it. I reached Peter Salofa's family on a video call in the 58th day after the Iron Covenant's operations concluded, 2 days before the assembly convened. They were on a mid-corridor residential station, a small community, her parents still in the same residence they had occupied when she was 9 years old, and they had put her on a commercial freight passage that had stopped at Maracaibo Corridor Node 3 in 2244. They had filed the missing person report within 6 days of the expected arrival date at her destination. They had followed up with coalition transit authorities 11 times in the following 4 years before the case had been marked inactive for lack of new information. I told them who I was and what I did and what I had found. I told them about the transaction record. I told them about the Iron Covenant. I told them that we had their daughter's file, that her identity was confirmed and documented in the Compact's evidentiary record, that her name was in the record and would remain there, and that what had been done to her had been witnessed and named, and that the framework that permitted it no longer existed. Her father asked me if it mattered, not aggressively, not as a challenge to what had been done, but as a genuine question, the question of a man who had spent 8 years not knowing where his 9-year-old daughter had gone and was now being told where she had gone, and who was trying to determine whether the answer to that question changed the weight of the 8 years. I told him I did not know. I told him I believed that naming the truth was not the same as remedying it, and that 430,000 warships were not the same as his daughter coming home, and that I had no answer for the distance between those things that would make the distance smaller. I told him that her name was in the record and that it would not be removed, and that I would see to it personally that it remained there. He thanked me. I am still not certain what he was thanking me for, and I have not tried to determine it, because I think some things do not resolve into an answer that you can examine without diminishing it. I have been, in the 12 years since Instrument 7, Varenthus, asked many times to characterize the Iron Covenant in the terms that people use for these characterizations: justice, retribution, disproportionate response, necessary action, excessive force. I have declined every time because those characterizations require a perspective I do not have, and because I believe that the transaction records speak more accurately than any characterization I could offer. 28,004 entries, classification codes, procedure codes, yield measurements, discharge dates. What the Iron Covenant did was read every one of those entries into the permanent record of the Compact's proceedings, attach a name to each one, and close the account. I was the analyst who did the attaching. I signed every record with my professional credential and the Coalition's Documentation Authority seal. My signature is on 28,004 documents in the Compact's permanent archive. I have not counted the hours it took. I did not count them at the time because counting would have been a way of measuring myself against the work rather than simply doing it, and the work did not require my measurement of it. It required accuracy and presence, and the willingness to continue. The Varenthus Syndicate had filed 43 pages and called it a commercial instrument. The Coalition had filed 4,812 pages and called it a record. The Iron Covenant had arrived with 430,000 warships. And what it had said, in the only language that a pharmaceutical industrial cartel operating through a 14-day objection window in compact trade law was ultimately designed to hear, was that the account was complete, that every transaction had been read, and that there was no further business to conduct. There was no further business. The syndicate's framework was gone. The 11 patron civilizations were gone. The stations were gone. The classification that had made it possible. The transit code that had created the gap. The objection window that had allowed the instrument to pass all of it gone, revised, closed, sealed into a 180-day mandatory active review that would prevent it from happening again in precisely the way it had happened this time. I do not know if it prevents it from happening in a different way. That is a question for the next analyst who finds an unfamiliar phrase in a footnote and pulls the reference. I hope that analyst exists. I hope they have the stubbornness to read primary sources. I hope their tea goes cold before they finish. What I know is that 28,004 names are in the permanent record, and they will not be moved. Pita Salofa is in the permanent record. She is the 6,891st entry in the cross-referenced identification database. Her full name, her age, her home station, her family contacts, her transit date, and her last known registration point, and the transaction record that was attached to her classification code. And below the transaction record, in the evidentiary field where the documentation teams were instructed to note any relevant supplementary information, the name of the lead analyst who confirmed the identification, and the date on which the identification was confirmed, and the analyst's attestation that the record was accurate and complete. My name is on that record. It will stay there. That is the only thing I have that I am certain counts for anything. And I have decided that it is enough, and on most days I believe it. The Iron Covenant answered with 430,000 warships. The answer was not grief. The answer was something that had been grief once and had been carried very carefully and had been set down in the only place where setting it down meant anything, the permanent record.